Let me show you 3 sewn crochet joins. They are perfect for using with squares or for garment panels or for joining motifs together. I'm going to show you the whip stitch and the mattress stitch and the zigzag stitch. Let's rejig that order though, because actually my least favourite is the zigzag stitch. I quite like the whip stitch, but my absolute creme de la creme way of doing a sewn join is to use the mattress stitch. It's a little more tricksy, but it's well worth learning. Let me take you through all 3 in this video tutorial, how to make them and what I would use them for. Zig-Zag Stitch is an easy way to join crochet panels. It is quite stretchy and the stitches are obvious, and if I'm truthful, a little untidy. I would maybe use this for lacy garments where you might want a deconstructed look. If you want really finessed crochet though, I don't think this is the best way to make a join. Let me show you how I joined 4 crochet squares together using zigzag stitch so you can make your own mind up. Start with a length of yarn that is at least 2 times the length of the total seam that you want to join, and thread it with a tapestry needle. You need one of these because they're blunted, so you're not going to split the yarn. I'm starting with 2 squares and I place them with right sides facing together, putting the wrong sides to the outsides. My squares have 2 corner chains and I will use both of them to start the zigzag stitch off. The square closest to me I'm calling square 1, and one furthest away is square 2. And the back loop of square 1 is the loop that is closest to me, and the back loop of square 2 is the loop that is furthest away from me. So we're always going to be working into the back loops of these 2 squares. Starting in the back loop of the first chain of square 1, I'm placing the needle from the front to the back, and I repeat this on square 2, placing the needle front to back and in the back loop only in that first chain. When I pull through the yarn, I'm leaving about a 5 to 10 centimetre end and I'm holding it down with my thumb. Next, I place the needle from back to front in the next stitch of square 2 and pull the yarn through. I repeat that for square 1 with the needle placed from back to front of square 1 and pulling through the yarn. To speed up the process, I can go front to back square 1, front to back square 2 and pull through the yarn, and then back to front square 2 and back to front square 1, always in the back loop. The stitches are making a zigzag pattern from one square to the next, and you're just going to simply repeat that process, going square 1 front to back, square 2 front to back, square 2 back to front, square 1 back to front, back loops only, all the way along the seam join. Now I'm at the corner chains. I have 2 chains at each corner, so I only want to use 1 on each side of this first join. Because of where my zigzag stitch last ended, I'm now going back to front on chain 1 of square 2 and back to front of chain 1 of square 1 to complete the seaming of the first 2 squares. Laying the squares flat, I can tug the 2 yarn ends to zip up the excess yarn. It's quite satisfying. Now if I bring the next 2 squares into play, as I did at the start, their right sides are placed together, wrong sides facing out. I'm then identifying the 1 chain on each side that I will use in the next bit of the join. Because my last stitch finished back to front on square 1, the first stitch of my new square has to be front to back on the new square 1. And we're ready to join these squares in. So I'm placing my needle from front to back of the back loop of the chain of the new square 1, and then from front to back in the back loop of the chain in the new square 2, and you can see that all 4 squares are now connected. Now I just need to repeat that zigzag stitch all the way up the seam, and I'll finish it when 2 of the corner chains are joined, leaving 2 unjoined for when they are seamed to the next part of the crochet. I have a little bit of a gap between my two sets of squares, and I'm just going to zip up the yarn and then scooch the two top squares down a little, and that completes join 1. To start join 2, rotate the squares 90 degrees, thread a new piece of yarn up, and then place the right sides together with the wrong sides facing out, as you did with join 1. Then zigzag stitch the initial 2 corner chains and continue to zigzag all the way up to the corner chains in the centre of the 4 squares. When I get to the centre of those 4 squares, there are 4 corner chains still to be joined. I'll continue to zigzag stitch them together through the back loops of the first 2 squares and then the final 2 squares. Sometimes I can struggle to see what is a chain and what is a stitch. I find it's handy to flip to the right side of the work to identify what is what. And if you're right-handed as a crocheter, if you're working in the round, then your stitches will always have a right hand lean to them, and that's what I use to identify what's a stitch and what is a chain. I've zigzag stitched all the way up the join 2, seaming up to the corner chains, and I've only joined up 2 of those corner chains on each side, leaving 2 for the next join. So that is it. That's how I've joined 4 crochet squares with zigzag stitch. It's okay, but I think the next stitch that I'm going to show you is even better. I am going to whip stitch together 4 crochet squares to show you the technique and what it looks like. It's got reasonable stretch to it. The actual stitches are quite neat, and you could use a contrast yarn as I have here to make a bit of a statement piece. Yeah, it's a nice stitch to use. If you use the same coloured yarn as your squares, motifs or panels, you don't really see the join. So I'm going to start with a length of yarn that is at least 2 times the length of my overall seam that I want to join together. Starting with just 2 squares, I place the right sides together so that the wrong sides are facing out. My squares that I am joining have got 2 corner chains at each of the corners, and I'm going to whip stitch both of them to begin with. I am only placing my needle for every whip stitch through the back loops of the squares. So square 1 is the one that is closest to me and square 2 is furthest away. So the back loop of square 1, as it would be on its right side, is the loop that is closest to me, and the back loop of square 2 is the loop that is furthest away from me. Let's start this whip stitch join. My needle is going from front to back through the back loop only of the first chain in square 1. I'm pulling the yarn through and leaving a 5 to 10 centimetre tail, which I can tether down with my thumb. Next, my needle is going from front to back through the back loop of the first chain of square 2, the one at the back. With whip stitch, the needle is always placed front to back and always from square 1 to square 2. So you can speed this up and work the needle through square 1 and square 2 at the same time before pulling through the thread. After about 4 centimetres, you might need to do what I call zipping up the yarn, where you pull the 2 yarn ends together and it pulls the seam join together really tightly. And then you can just continue to whip stitch all the way up to the corner chains. At the corners, I'm only joining one of the 2 corner chains on each side. The other 2 corner chains are required when I come to do join 2. Now I add in the next 2 squares and place them right sides together, wrong sides facing out. Starting with the corner chain, whip stitch the 2 new squares, binding them to the original 2 squares. Every 4 centimetres or so, I'm going to zip up that yarn to create a really nice, neat, tight join, and then continue to whip stitch to the end, and the end is when I have done the corner chains, one corner chain on each side at the very end of the squares. To start join 2, I'm rotating the squares by 90 degrees. I'm cutting another length of yarn and I'm threading it through my needle. I want to flip so that the right sides are together and the wrong sides are facing out, but I also want to make sure that I'm joining the right sides and not actually creating a tube. Now I'm joining both corner chain spaces as I did at the beginning of join 1. I'll whip stitch all of the remaining stitches, and basically it's working front to back in the back loop of square 1 and then front to back in the back loop of square 2, and repeating that for every available stitch. At the corner chain spaces beyond the beginning ones, I'm only working one of each of those chain spaces because in the centre cross the extra ones have already been utilised, and at the top I only need to use one of each of them. When all 4 squares have been whip stitched together, the visible stitches are really quite neat, as is the central cross. I think it looks quite nice in a contrast yarn colour, but if you want an almost invisible join, then what you really want is my third and final sewn join recommendation, which is the mattress stitch. Mattress stitch is the best way to sew crochet together. It's neat and almost invisible. It's great for crocheted squares, for motifs, for garments. This is the joining stitch to use if you want flawless crochet. Let me show you how to do it. I want to start with 4 squares just because that is what I'm joining together. I want to get a length of yarn that is 4 times the length of my join and thread it to a tapestry needle which is blunted so it won't split my yarn. And to start I'm just working with 2 of the squares, ideally on a flat surface, and you want the right sides facing up. The squares I am joining have 2 chains at each corner, and I will start by using both. But when I get to the next set of corner chains, I will actually only use one on this first join and the other will be used on join 2. So my needle is going from front to back in the back loop only of the first chain of the square on the left. Then from back to front of the second chain. I'm pulling it through and leaving about a 5 to 10 centimetre tail on the yarn because I'm going to need that not just for weaving in but also for zipping up the join. Picking up the square on the right now, I'm placing the needle again from the front to the back in the back loop only of the first chain, and then placing it from the back to the front through the second chain. Stitches are always made in the back loop to help hide the actual stitches themselves, particularly if you're using a contrast colour. Mattress stitch is worked back and forth from one side to the other. Each new stitch starts in a stitch that was already used and it ends up in a new stitch. Working on the left square, I'm placing my needle from front to back of the last stitch used in that square, and then from back to front of the next unused stitch in the same square. That is repeated on the square on the right, taking my needle from front to back through the stitch that has already been used, and then from back front into an unused stitch. That sequence is then repeated all the way up the join. So left square, front to back through the old stitch, then back to front through the new stitch, always back loop only. Then you move to the right square, that's front to back through the old stitch, then back to front through the new unused stitch. And repeat, it's that simple. After about 4 centimetres of mattress stitch, it's time to zip up stitches. I love this bit. By holding on to the yarn tail at the bottom and pulling the needle end of the yarn, it zips up the stitches and creates that join. It's so satisfying. I always need to prise open the top a little bit to remind myself of where my next stitch is. It won't harm your stitches at all, they will just tighten up again with your next zip up. I'm only using one of the 2 chains at each corner, the others are used in join 2. On both squares I have used the corner chains at the top and now need to join the next 2 squares in. Starting with my left square, I'm going and putting my needle from front to back in the last used stitch, which was a chain. Now I need to jump the needle up to the new left square and come up from back to front in the back loop of the first chain. Moving back to the initial right hand square, my needle is going front to back in the already used chain stitch, then back to front in the chain of the new right hand square. All 4 squares are now connected. I'll do a couple more repeats before I then zip up the stitches and you'll see all 4 corners come together and how beautiful this join is. I will continue to mattress stitch all the way up to the corner chain of the second set of squares, and that will complete join 1, ready to move on to join 2. Join 2 starts the exact same way as join 1, but with the squares rotated 90 degrees. Where it does differ though is when you get to the 4 corners at the centre, so let me quickly get to there and I'll show you what's different. The 4 corner chains all need to be mattress stitched, but the yarn has to stay on the wrong side. My needle is going front to back in the corner chain of the initial left square. I'm scooping the needle under the other join stitches, then bringing the needle back to the front of the first chain of the new left square. Where it gets more difficult is that my needle now needs to go to the back for the initial right hand square. So my needle has to initially come up through a gap between the left and the right squares. Then it can be placed front to back through the chain on the right square. I can scoop my needle to the back and under the joins. My needle is then coming up through the chain, back to front of the chain in the new right square. Now I can just mattress stitch all the way to the end and zip up those final few stitches to reveal a beautiful crochet join. All of the central corners sit perfectly together and you cannot see the contrast yarn colour at all. I have shown you 3 quick and easy sewn joins for crochet, but I suspect that, like me, your favourite is mattress stitch. If you prefer photo tutorials, I have linked all 3 for you for the 3 different stitches, so zigzag, whip and mattress stitch, in case you want to learn at a slower pace with text and with photos.